Hello, my name is Michael Tillotson, and I am the author of these two books right here. Aren't they pretty? So, the term aspiring writer or aspiring author can really refer to one of two general categories of people. There are the people who are actually writing something, and there are those who only really have an idea of what they want, but don't know how to actually get started on writing it. This video is designed for the people who fall into that second category. Anyone can have an idea. I want to sit down and talk about how to write the darn thing. So, the first thing to note is just about anyone can be the idea guy. I'm not sure I've ever met someone who's a big fan of any given piece of media who hasn't had their own ideas for what they'd make as their dream book or their dream movie or their dream video game, etc. One of the kind of hard truths when it comes to turning your dream insert piece of media here into a reality, though, is most people do not actually understand the ins and outs of what makes their favorite piece of media good. As a result, if you had some sort of magic spell that could take these people's ideas straight out of their heads and transform them into whatever their media of choice is, you might wind up with one or two good scenes here or there, but overall you're probably going to wind up with something that's pretty awful. And this isn't an insult. This applied to me too. I've had plenty of ideas that are just total rubbish. This is why the most important step towards making your project a reality is research. If you want to be a story writer, then you should check out Hello Future Me or Overly Sarcastic Productions. If you want to be a game designer, you should take a look at Adam Millard, Architect of Games, or Game Maker's Toolkit. If you want to be a movie director, you should... Okay, well, I don't actually know. I've never looked into that one. But you get my point. I'll link all of those channels in the description, by the by. They're all very good. Some people might have a bit more of an intuition for whatever media they're looking into making, but nobody is going to be a master right from the get-go, and this kind of research is important to reaching that level of mastery. If you're here, though, then you probably already know that. That's presumably why you're here, after all, so we won't talk anymore about that particular point. But okay, so you've done your research, what next? Well, firstly, you're never done with your research. Keep learning and growing. But the next would be to do some pre-story prep. You may have heard the terms plotting and pantsing in reference to this topic before, and they pretty much just refer to how much prep work you're putting into your story. The more of a plotter you are, the more details you've written out before ever actually starting a word of the story, and the more of a pantser you are, the more you're writing by the seat of your pants, which basically just means you're winging it as you go. Some people swear by pantsing, but for me personally, I would recommend going down more the plotter route. Especially when you're writing your first story, you're probably going to find out pretty quickly once you actually sit down with pencil or more likely keyboard in hand that your ideas are kind of sporadic, disorganized. The big thing I find a lot of new writers struggle with, and something I struggle with a lot, is how to get from point A to point B. Sure, you know that the hero goes on a daring journey through the enchanted forest to pull the magic MacGuffin sword from its pedestal, but then you don't actually know what happens in that forest, and you wind up with this big writer's block where you're like, oh, I know what happens next, I just don't know how to get there. Sitting down and putting in a little bit of extra time before you start writing, though, can help a lot with this kind of thing. I've had a lot of scrapped projects in the past, and it's no coincidence that the first two I've actually finished, these two right here, I sat down and put in a little prep work beforehand. With The Heart of the World, my prep work was still pretty loose. I didn't outline specific chapters or anything, but the original version of The Heart of the World was something of a joke. It wasn't anything I was taking all that seriously, so the original idea for the plot was filled with all sorts of nonsense. And I basically sat down, and I took the story I already had and ironed it out to be something actually decent. With The Witch of the Starlit Coven, I put in even more prep. and I wrote a short summary of every single chapter. There was still things I didn't know, like throughout the story the heroes are hunting down these things called the Artifacts of Z, and I knew what maybe 3 or 4 of them were before starting, but the rest I was just making up as I went along. But for the most part, I made sure to have a document outlining something before I actually put a metaphorical pen to metaphorical paper. Metaphorical because I used a computer. Speaking of all this prep work though, you might be thinking, oh, this means I should sit down and spend 20 hours world building, right? Well, I would actually recommend you avoid doing that. At least for your first book. Like, don't get me wrong, I love a deep, immersive world. But if you've never written a book before, you have no idea if you're actually going to be able to stick with it. And this kind of ties into my when should you edit essay. But you don't want to put in a ton of extra work for a project that you don't even know you're actually going to finish. Now, I'm not saying to do no world building. Oh, heavens no. Do some world building, please. But keep that world building to a reasonable size. Before starting The Heart of the World, I knew there were going to be 3 different magic systems, and I knew the broad strokes of each. PHM was going to use magic weapons, WHM was going to be like earthbending and stuff, HC was going to use runes. But I didn't go in and work out every little detail of these magic systems until I started writing. Like HC magic, for instance, was initially conceptualized with this idea to be able to copy someone's powers and abilities by drawing their soul sigil and creating a sort of stationary shadow copy of them. But while this was cool, I found when I actually got to the halfway point of Heart of the World, when HC magic was introduced, it didn't really jive with the rest of the world building, and so that's when I decided to cut it. When I was halfway through the first draft. And of course, there's the example I like to bring up a lot, that in the original intro, Sophia had a Pegasus that she wrote in on. And it was only after I finished the first draft that I got to editing, and I was like, yeah, that's not a thing. Or, to put it another way, I would recommend writing your characters first, world second. The characters are the core of any story, and so if you figure out them, who they are, what their character arc is like, then you can build the story around them in a way so that any world building you make exists in a way that supports their character arcs. And to be clear, this method of writing is not better than doing a bunch of world building first. There's a lot that can come out of putting so much dedicated time just towards world building. This method of writing, rather, is easier, at least in my opinion, and when starting your first writing project, anything that makes the process a little easier is going to go a long way. It's worth noting, however, if you're planning on making a bunch of sequels, then by their very nature as sequels and prequels, they can't use this world building method as much. Since they'll be borrowing the world building from the first book, it can feel kind of cheap if the world and the rules are suddenly changing in the sequels. So if you'd rather avoid this method so that you don't get used to it when it comes time to write your second book, where it can't apply as well, that's fair. But alright, so you've got your research and your prep work done, and all that's left to do is to sit down and actually start writing. So this is going to have some overlap with my Should You Write Every Day video, but now that it's time to write, you really need to sit down with a consistent schedule. As I mentioned in that other video, I wouldn't recommend writing every day, but you do want to get yourself in the habit of writing on a regular basis. It's really easy to have an idea on starting something new, only to just kind of put it off. And the more you don't do that thing, the easier it becomes to not do that thing. So set a schedule for yourself where there's a certain time of day or a certain day of the week or something where you just sit down and write. If you find yourself with writer's block and you can't actually get it written down, well, firstly, don't worry. You're presumably pretty new at this, and that's okay. But if you're like me, then by default, when you think of a new scene in your head, you tend to think of it like a movie. You see the scene play out rather than hear it being read. So if you're sitting down to write and you just aren't getting anywhere, try to shift the way you think about these scenes when you're not writing. Try to think specifically of how you want it written, not how it looks. And finally, especially as a first-time writer, but even as you become more experienced, there are going to be things you're good at and other things that you aren't. For instance, I think I personally am pretty good at dialogue and characterization, but I'm not as great with descriptions, especially interiors. If I needed to describe this room, it would all be very vague. But that's okay. No writer is perfect at everything, so don't beat yourself up if you're not up to par. One thing to remember about your first draft here is that it's not terribly important for it to be good yet. The first draft is mostly about getting things done, and the following drafts are about cleaning it up and making it into something good. In fact, most authors' first drafts are kind of terrible. Some of my favorite scenes in The Heart of the World were added in the later drafts, and there were even entire chapters that got cut or added. But that's all for me. I hope this video has been helpful to you, and I hope to one day see your books on the metaphorical shelf. See you in another video.